Okay, so first off, thank you to Stephanie and all the organizers of this conference for having me. Today I'm presenting some collaborative research with Marcus Schaefer from the Department of Sociology at the University of Toronto entitled Religious Attendance and Network Change in Later Life, the Role of Functional Health Status. So just to give an overview, I don't think this will be news to anybody here, but we know that social connections are important to the health and general well-being of older adults, especially by providing access to social support, preventing loneliness and social isolation. But we also know that individual social networks change quite a bit during the aging process, due in part to life course transitions, losing a spouse or other important network members, due to health decline, leaving the workforce, and the emptying of children and others from the familial home. And as a result of these life course transitions, older adult social lives are usually fairly highly dynamic. So there are very few older adults who have stable, unchanging social environments for any long period of time. And this really is true of even the closest, most stable parts of one's social network. But one thing we really don't know a lot about are how changes in religious participation in later life shape older adults' social networks. And I think this is an important oversight for a number of reasons. First, research has well established that the elderly have higher overall levels of religious involvement compared to younger adults. So we know that processes of secularization and so forth have sort of pulled younger adults away from religion and especially institutional religious practice. We also know that spiritual issues gain prominence near the end of life. So as individuals approach death, they may be fearful of what will happen to them. But also some other things in later life. They may be adjusting to health declines. They may lose relationships and look to religion as a form of coping. We also know that religious groups and the connections that are formed through religious institutions are really important sources of both tangible and emotional support for older adults. Some work by Neil Krauss has shown that the support received from religious groups has a stronger impact on health and well-being than support received from secular groups. But there's also sort of this reciprocal process going on where declining health, especially past age 70, might make it harder for older adults to attend religious services, and this might have implications for their ability to connect with others in their congregation. So we currently have some knowledge as to the extent of religious change in older adulthood and why this happens. So on the whole, we know that older adults tend to maintain fairly regular church attendance, and this usually is, reflective of patterns that they have established earlier in their life course. And one really comprehensive study by Silverstein and Bankston in 2018 tracked religiosity in later life, especially between the ages of 60 and 70, and they did find that stability appeared to be the norm. But also here, roughly 1/3 of their sample experienced some change in religiosity over time. So 21% increase and 11% decrease in religiosity. And a really neat feature of this study was they had a qualitative component asking older adults reasons why they increased or decreased in their religiosity. So there were several reasons why respondents reported increasing in religiosity. One is their interest in worldly things changed. So perhaps as they, reach the end of life, they are less interested in material things and more interested in engaging in spiritual matters. Some older adults also reported a desire for spiritual growth. And a particularly prominent reason for becoming more religious in later life was out of concern for the religious development of their children or grandchildren. So perhaps wanting to set an example of religious practice and integrate the family together under a common religious practice, and then also using religious resources for dealing with loss, and then also to have greater social connections as individuals are exiting the workforce and the family home is becoming perhaps emptier. As far as the reasons for decreasing religiosity, the study really revealed that poor health was a reason why older adults couldn't attend religious practice as often. And so that will certainly play into the setup of our current study and also our findings. So research on social networks has found homophily on a wide range of behavioral and identity dimensions, including religiosity. So we know that preferences for similar peers may lead people to select friends who are like themselves, whether that be with age, gender, race, but also religious beliefs and practices, and to dissolve friendships with dissimilar others. So we see religion as potentially an important source of friendship selection. And especially in later life, religion constitutes one of the most important social identities for older adults. So when it comes to religious practice, having the same or the same religious practice indicates at least some broad agreement about the world, which could make social relationships more rewarding. So on average, two people of the same religion with similar religious practices are probably going to follow similar norms and rules of behavior. They might also like doing similar activities that are perhaps facilitated through religious institutions. So religious homophily could be a very important bonding agent in network relationships. On the other hand, though, religion also has the ability to, tear people apart as much as it brings people together. So in a fairly recent study, about 12% of Americans report having lost a friend over religious disagreement. So religion could be a very polarizing aspect of people's social lives that might have a great influence on social connection. So we use two theories in this study, one from social gerontology and one from cultural sociology. So the first one here, I don't think it will be of any surprise to many of you here, socio-emotional selectivity theory, which basically states that trajectories of change that happen in later life social connections are characterized by a dwindling flock of social ties. Perhaps older adults come to view their time as more limited and prioritize those social connections, which are really important to them and have sort of stood the test of time. But lots of research has revealed that this occurs mainly in the periphery of one social network. So to non-kin ties, to friendship ties, sort of ties that are not one's perhaps immediate family. So kin members of the core network may be relatively unaffected by network, in terms of network composition, regardless of the religious change going on within that older adult. So religion is, very much like any other transition that was going to happen, in later life. Those who are going to stay close are going to stay close regardless of that older adult's religious practice. The second theory, we use the idea of cultural worldviews influencing network selection from cultural sociology. So here, this view sort of asserts religion as a cultural moral worldview that can structure social relationships. So in 2003, Darren Shurkat wrote that people choose friends in accordance with their religious preferences, so valued others are likely to reinforce these existing desires rather than to arouse new ones. And we see this as happening again, in line with socio-emotional selectivity theory, probably in the non-kin, more peripherally based social ties. So network change could perhaps be very much responsive to people's changes in religious participation as they go through the aging process. And of course, in keeping with the theme of the conference here today, health may have a role in the processes that we hypothesize. So of course, health decline reduces an ability of an older adult to maintain relationships, particularly weak ties or peripheral ties. And there's really two processes going on here. So for older adults, attendance at religious service does tend to wane as chronic health and disability problems pile up and functional limitations increase. But older adults facing health challenges may come to depend more on social networks of coordinated support. This could imply denser networks of kin. It could also imply reaching out to religious communities for help and support, for instance, in getting to doctor's appointments or so forth. So we think that one's health in later life could decrease formal religious participation, and according to socio-emotional selectivity theory, could also lead to a decline in the number of non-kin ties that an older adult has. So we'll test that process as well with our data. So a summary of our three main research questions. The first two are simply, are changes in religious attendance associated with adding or retaining kin and non-kin from the network? And then three, to what extent do changes in functional health status or disability explain the network change associated with changes in religious attendance? So we use data from all three available waves of the National Social Life, Health, and Aging Project. So this was launched in 2005, and every 5 years up until 2015, there was a new wave of data. Initially, older adults were aged between 57 and 85 at the first wave of the NSHAP survey. So our dependent variables come from the Ego Network name generator. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with this. So respondents could list up to 5 names of people that they discussed important matters with, and they could add an additional name. So how it worked in NSHAP, if the spouse was not listed and the older adult was married, so if they weren't listed in the first 5 names, they actually were placed on that 6th line as the 6th network member. So our dependent variable are measures of additions and losses of kin and non-kin network members. So at each wave, respondents were shown on the computer their previous wave's roster and their current wave roster, and they were asked to indicate basically whether, Rob, who was listed at wave 1, was also the same Rob that was listed at wave 2. And they also looked at that relationship of the named alter to the ego. So we here distinguished kin and non-kin gains and losses at each wave. So religious attendance was measured with a very simple question: how often do you attend religious services? To ensure reasonably large cell size across groups, we coded this into a 3-category variable: low, moderate, and high attendance, according to what you see there on the slide. And we were really interested in changes in religious attendance between wave 1 and wave 2, and wave 2 and wave 3 of the NSHAP survey. So I'll show in a few slides what these categories were and what this looked like. We also looked at change in functional health status. So at each wave, we took the average difficulty respondents had with the 7 activities of daily life. So things like eating, dressing, getting in and out of bed. And we were interested in the change in ADL difficulty between wave 2 and wave 1, and between wave 3 and wave 2. So here, higher or positive values indicate greater increases in disability. So that person is becoming more functionally disabled over time. In the interest of time, I won't talk much about the covariates other than just to show you what we adjusted for, pretty standard. The variables that could occur as transitions between waves, such as partnership status and employment, we looked at between each successive wave of NSHAP. So for our analytic strategy, we use a pooled regression approach. So basically what we did, we created 2 separate data sets, a wave 1 to wave 2 data set and a wave 2 to wave 3 data set. So in the first data set, we consider variables that were measured at wave 1 as time 1 variables, and variables measured at wave 2 as time 2 variables. And then in the second data set, we use variables at wave 2 are considered time 1, and variables at wave 3 are considered time 2. So we combine these data sets together to increase the N of cases that we had, and then we measure religious change between time 1 and time 2. So the idea here is that one respondent can contribute up to 2 cases. So they can contribute a wave 1 to wave 2 and a wave 2 to wave 3 case if they remained in the NSHAP sample across all 3 waves. But they could also contribute a wave 1 to wave 2 case only, or a wave 2 to wave 3 case only. So we clustered observations within respondents and used robust standard errors. We also used inverse probability weighting to account for sample attrition. To look at the count of kin and non-kin added or lost from the network, we used Poisson regression with some exposure terms. So basically, we conditioned on the respondent having at least one kin or non-kin tie in their network at time 1. So basically, the idea here, they had to have a potential to lose a kin or non-kin tie between time 1 and time 2. So here are some descriptives before getting into the regression results. So this is what change in religious attendance looked like between time 1 and time 2. So 5 categories, basically 3 groups representing stability and 2 representing a decrease or an increase. So we see here that stable high attendance was the norm. About 39% was the modal category. So this would fit with research that older adults do tend to be fairly religiously involved, even as they age. But there was also about 25% of older adults who were stably low across time. What was interesting to us was over 25% of the sample had either an increase or decrease in religious attendance over time. And so we wondered how this might shape social network change. So just something to keep in mind before I show the results. Also, just to give you a sense of overall network size across the 3 waves of NSHAP. So we do see that network size does tend to increase a little bit between wave 1, wave 2, and wave 3. So the average network had 3.5 named confidants at wave 1, and 3.8 in 2010 at wave 2, and also 3.8 at wave 3. So, a slight increase over time. Now to show a little bit about the summary of ties lost in our analytic sample. So almost 80% of respondents lost at least one tie between wave 1 and wave 2. So the average number of ties lost between wave 1 and wave 2 and wave 2 to wave 3 in the overall sample is 2. In the kin sample is 1, and in the non-kin sample is 1. So just kind of reinforcing the idea that older adults' networks are going through some change between different time points of the NSHAP. Very similar we see for the summary of ties added. So on average, individuals add about 2 ties to their network between wave 1 and wave 2 and wave 2 and wave 3. And this works out roughly to 1 kin tie and 1 non-kin tie added between each series of 2 waves. Finally, here, the last set of descriptive statistics I'll show before getting into the main results. So what I show here is the average level of ADL difficulty on the y-axis. So this figure on the whole shows that between wave 1 and wave 3 of NSHAP, the sample is becoming more disabled. Due to the aging process, people are reporting more difficulty with the activities of daily life. We see here in this third set of bars that those with stably high attendance report the lowest level of ADL difficulty. So this would fit in with narratives showing that high attendance does tend to be beneficial for the health of older adults. And then I draw your attention here to this fourth set of bars here, those with decreases in religious participation. So here, the average ADL difficulty increases between wave 1 and wave 2 quite a bit, from 0.15 to 0.25. And this group also has the highest level of functional problems at wave 3. So this suggests that religious attendance and functional disability are related, and it could possibly be that functional status makes it harder for older adults to continue their religious participation. So for our modeling strategy, we show 2 models for each outcome. In model 1, we look at our categorical variable of change in religious attendance, adding in our study covariates. And in model 2, we have everything in model 1, but then we also add in change in disability status. And this lets us understand whether change in disability status explains the relationship between changes in religious attendance and network turnover. Okay, so we'll start with adding and dropping kin from the network by transitions in religious attendance. So looking first at the number of kin added, those stably high in religious attendance were more likely to add kin ties. And this association held in both Model 1 and Model 2, so regardless of the addition of changes in disability status to the model. Moving to the number of kin ties dropped, no religious transition category predicted losing kin ties with or without adjustment for disability status. So we run an exact same series of models for adding and dropping non-kin from the network. So looking first at non-kin added. So here, those who decrease in attendance between waves are less likely to add non-kin ties, while those who increase in attendance are more likely to add non-kin ties. And both of these associations persist net of controls for changes in functional disability status. So moving to non-kin ties lost, here we see that the stable high attenders, so people who were weekly attenders or more across the two time points, were less likely to lose non-kin ties. And again, this relationship also persisted with control for change in disability status in Model 2. And then finally, we see that decreases in religious attendance were associated with a higher number of non-kin ties lost. But as we can see here, moving from Model 1 to Model 2, this association was explained by the addition of changes in disability or functional health status. So this reduced the significant association that we saw in Model 1 to non-significance. So just to briefly discuss our results, we know that social networks change in midlife course and age-related transitions in later life, but little existing research has looked at changes in religiosity and how they might factor into this. And this is a bit surprising because religious communities are a really central point of social activity in later life, and as well, most older adults tend to be at least somewhat religious. So we see that high levels and stable levels of religiosity appear to promote stability and also reintegration of family into networks. So this idea that the family that prays together stays together, but also perhaps gets back together. And so we ask, and one of the things we're currently working on is trying to figure out, does religion really accentuate socio-emotional selectivity processes? So the emphasis on family life that's typical to most religious traditions, it might actually heighten the age-related tendencies that are implied in socio-emotional selectivity theory. So it might be the case that religious older adults experience even less than usual turnover in their core networks, especially in their innermost social circles. So I'm speaking here about that finding that stable high attenders were more likely to gain kin ties relative to stable low attenders. And then we also saw quite a bit of action when looking at increases or decreases in religious attendance. And these really promote the formation or dissolution of friendship or non-kin ties. So we thought that patterns for decreases in religious attendance could be explained by functional health decline, that when older adults are simply not able to attend religious services because of their health, they may experience greater turnover in their non-kin networks. But it may also be about a religious worldview process, this cultural idea of network selection, because those increasing in religious attendance were also more likely to gain non-kin ties. So it's likely that there's a process beyond health decline going on that's explaining why we're seeing these patterns of turnover in response to changes in religious attendance. So I just want to discuss a few limitations of the current work and some of the future research directions that Marcus and I are working on. So first, we couldn't determine whether respondents' network members who were lost or added actually belonged to their religious congregation. But arguably, this actually might give us greater confidence in the results of our study. So transitions in religiosity could structure congregational and non-congregational network ties. So the influence of religious participation and changes in religious participation could operate above and beyond the institutional structures of religion. Unfortunately, unlike Silverstein and Bankston's study, we did not know why older adults changed their religious attendance. It could perhaps be due to health decline, but as we saw from that early slide, there could be many other reasons as well. So future qualitative work to explore why older adults are changing their religious attendance and how this may shape their network ties is certainly warranted. There's also a question of causal ordering. So we found it most plausible to assume that changes in religious attendance affect networks, but network change could also affect religious attendance, right? So it could be the case that people are drawn into religion because of who they are associating themselves with. We think this is less the case with older adults because they tend to have pretty firmly ingrained routines of religious practice that may be less susceptible to influence. There's also some limitations of the name generator tool. So to the extent that people derive support and companionship from those outside of their core discussion networks, the tools we use may provide an incomplete account of network turnover. But nevertheless, we assume that the inclusion or exclusion of kin or non-kin members from one's discussion networks really does signify a potentially important shift in the social world of older adults. As a religion researcher, it's very clear that religiosity is a multidimensional construct. So we had only a measure of religious attendance and participation that we looked at here. But certainly older adults could also undergo change in many other aspects of religiosity, such as belief salience, prayer, or the beliefs about a divine power. So belief salience was asked at wave 1 and wave 2 of NSHAP, but unfortunately not at the third wave. So though the aging process might make in-person religious attendance a little bit more difficult, it's possible that older adults could still maintain their beliefs in a religious worldview. And finally, one of the current questions that Marcus and I are tackling is, is religion unique, or do other forms of secular participation show similar patterns? So are changes in volunteering patterns or participation in other secular formal organizations associated with a similar pattern of network change? So the NSHAP does have access to some of these, and we're looking at how this might work for something like volunteering, which also is known to have health benefits and is an activity that older adults tend to be very engaged in. So if any of you are interested in these, we've started to run some preliminary analyses. And then, of course, as probably most of your research agendas are impacted by the COVID-19 era, so this question of the impact of social distancing on older adult social networks and how religion might factor into this. So in the United States, older adults could have experienced involuntary decline in religious participation due to the COVID-19 pandemic through church closures or simply by their own choice not to go to church because of their vulnerability to the virus and wanting to avoid large gatherings. So a question going forward, what will post-pandemic religious attendance look like for older adults, and might this further exacerbate some of these associations we're seeing here when we're looking at those who make the choice to go back to church or who choose not to. So thank you very much for all of your time, and I certainly look forward to your questions in the Q&A.